Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Milton Sharma Show, a show that describes a variety of subjects through the lens of civil discourse. I'm your host, Milton, and today my guest is Gabriela Rosa, who is the founder and director of the Rosa Institute, an organization focused on improving clinical outcomes and advancing scientific knowledge in reproductive medicine to help couples overcome fertility challenges and conceive healthy babies. The Institute is committed to promoting effective men's and women's health diagnoses, treatment, and self-efficacy through education for long-term well-being. Gabriela's academic accomplishments include completing a master's in public health, clinical effectiveness, which includes that degree, at Harvard University's T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where she was awarded the Scholar Award for Academic Excellence. Currently pursuing Harvard's Doctor of Public Health program. Gabriela already holds a Master of Health and Medicine, which is Reproductive Health and Human Genetics, and a Bachelor of Health Science. She is trained in various health disciplines, including naturopathy, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, correct me if I'm wrong, nutrition, and botanical herbal medicine. Her podcast, Talk Sex with Gabriela Rosa, explores a holistic conversation about desire, pleasure, and satisfaction, aiming to guide individuals on a journey of self-discovery, whether they are on the fertility journey or not. Gabriela's latest book, Fertility Breakthrough, Overcoming Infertility and Recurrent Miscarriage When Other Treatments Have Failed, is now available at reputable bookstores, and you can find all that information in the link below, which is fertilitybreakthrough.com. So with that big introduction, Gabriela, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's it is a big introduction. I'm like, wow, who is that person?
Yeah, of course. It's a pleasure to have you here. So I'm sure for anyone listening with the idea of fertility and just that concept, I feel like everyone knows what fertility is, what the definition of infertility and fertility means, but there's a lot of details behind it that we all don't know about. And that's why I wanted to have you on. So I'm curious, what drove you to this field of study, to this topic, and what's your passion behind it all?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. And I was really pondering on the answer to that question today, actually. Really thinking about, what is it that drove me to do this? What is it that actually made me excited about the prospect of devoting my life? Because it's been 22 years of doing this work for me, and I don't see myself stopping anytime soon. So, from that perspective, I've always felt like, wow, what is it that keeps me excited about it? And because I was thinking about that today, it's actually a perfect day to answer it. What I realized over the years is that although some of the flavors of why I do what I do has changed, the innate reason has remained the same throughout. And that is because I love to inspire people to really be the best version of themselves. And I found that the work of infertility, it comes to people at a time in their life where they're really questioning what's important. When most people conceive without trying, as you know, going through school, what is it that we're told? Don't have sex because you're going to get pregnant. If you're a girl, that is. Or, for the boys, it's probably don't make that girl pregnant,
Right.
So I don't know what boys are told because I was in a household of two girls. So I just know what girls were told. But I have two boys. And so I imagine that that's what I will be telling them. But the reality of it is that that's what usually happens. It's, we're told about the dangers of unprotected intercourse. We're talked to about, how your life will end if you have a baby. And so for the most part, most people really try to prevent that quite vehemently until probably somewhere around their mid-30s these days, or early 40s, for many. And at which point female fertility is already on the brink of extinction, and so that becomes something that is problematic, because then the difficulty of getting pregnant starts to increase, and the risk of miscarriage also starts to increase. There's also data these days that shows that, male fertility also begins to decline in terms of sperm quality at about that 40-year-old kind of age. So there's many of those factors that things that we have been told, things that at the juncture where people usually come to me, they really are questioning their values. They really are questioning the things that are important to them. They really are questioning, how have I done what I wanted with my life? How many times do you see people question that time of either getting married or having a baby as, have I done all the things that I wanted to do before I make that huge commitment? Because when you make the commitment to have a baby, it's kind of permanent, for a really long time. And so you really want to be quite sure about that decision. But I've seen over the years that because people are in that mindset of, this is it, now I want to have a baby, and especially because of where I sit in that conversation, typically they've been trying for more than 2 years. They've done lots of different types of treatments that haven't worked. They've experienced infertility. They've experienced miscarriage. So they really are at a very vulnerable state. They're not the usual, at that point, they're no longer thinking about, gosh, if I have sex, I'm going to get pregnant and I don't want that. They're really desperate about the reverse outcome, right? And so I started to see that more and more in my practice. I trained as a naturopathic doctor, as you said. And in the early days, I used to see all sorts of health conditions, and mostly women's and men's health conditions, but really not so much specifically focused on fertility. I would say that about maybe 30% of my practice was fertility and the rest was general health. And as the time passed, 5 years down the track, 10 years down the track, I actually went, you know what, I want to be doing a whole lot more of this. In fact, I want to become the best in the world at uncovering the reasons as to why this doesn't work. And it was at that point that I decided, okay, we're now solely going to specialize in fertility, and we're going to help couples who have been infertile for the longest time, who thought that this would never happen, actually have a baby. And what made me start to think about that was actually a patient of mine who came to me. She was the very first patient who came to me after being infertile for 10 years. And really, she was kind of the mindset that, well, we've done IVF cycles, it's failed. We've done everything that we've been told, it's failed. This is kind of my last ditch resort of trying to make anything happen. She really wasn't that upset if she didn't even get pregnant. She just wanted to improve areas of her health as well. And so it made me feel a whole lot more comfortable about not having someone pin their hopes for their future on me. Because you can imagine a lot of patients come and they're like, you have to solve this problem and you have to do it. And nowadays I'm quite comfortable with that, and I know that our fertility program, we did a study of the program when I was actually doing my master's in public health at Harvard, and 544 patients, we saw that the program actually has a 78.8% live birth rate. So 80% of people or thereabouts who come to us will take home a baby. So these days it's a very different situation, because I know this is going to work, or it's very highly likely to work. Right. Back then, I didn't have that certainty. I didn't have that data, and I certainly didn't have that understanding. And so, but it kind of, because she was so blasé about it, to put it mildly, it wasn't that she was blasé. She had lost that desperation that you see so often when people are just starting to try and they've been infertile for a year. Or 2 or 3 or even 5. Sometimes, when you've been infertile for 10 years, it's kind of like, well, this hasn't happened in 10 years. It's probably never going to happen. I might as well just kind of just so that I can tell myself that I did absolutely everything I could, and that I'm not going to sit on my porch when I'm 90 years of age in my rocking chair, looking back at my life and thinking, maybe I should have done this. I will do it now. So it was kind of like a have no regrets type situation. And I welcomed that. And we did what it is that we needed to do. 5 months later, she was pregnant for the first time in her entire adult life. And I was as shocked as she was.
Right. I mean, a decade, that's unbelievable to think about.
Exactly. So I was as shocked as she was, but we kind of we got through that moment. And, she now has a beautiful baby boy. I think he's going to be about 13 or something this year. And so, and I still keep in touch with this beautiful couple. But after her, there was another after we had that success, and it's amazing how the universe kind of just brings things at the time that they most need to be brought to you. After she came to me with the 10 years of infertility, I had another couple come to me in a very similar situation, having been infertile for 19 years. And this time I thought, for sure, this is just not going to happen. This is just one of those times where I used to, these days not so much anymore, but I used to take on couples sometimes if I felt that they really needed that closure, of their chapter, of trying to have a baby. I used to take them on for the sole purpose of helping them have that closure, doing everything they possibly could to feel like, what? I've given it my best. I've done everything. And, and they would be happy, and I would be happy to have supported and being there with them in that moment. And for this couple, honestly, in my mind, that's why I was taking them on, because I was 19 years. I mean, really, multiple failed IVF cycles, same story, that I often see now. I thought this is just never going to happen. So we might as well just really do the very best that we can for this person to be as well and healthy and mentally stable and just, as empowered as they can be in their life, which is really why I started to do this whole thing anyway, right? And so that's what we did. And again, very, very quickly after that, this woman too was pregnant. And then I started to think, and at this time I was still doing general and fertility. At that time I started to think, hang on a second, why is not everybody doing this? Because I'm thinking, gosh, if it can work for people who have been infertile for 10 years and 19 years. And, then I had another lady who came to me who had done 20 failed IVF cycles, 20 failed IVF cycles. Now, in Australia at the time, one IVF cycle cost $15,000.
Wow.
Imagine.
That's unreal.
That's a nice little deposit for a house,
Yeah.
In a very nice kind of oceanfront scenario. So I was like, wow, and so this woman came to me and she was adamant. She had one child already who she conceived via IVF after the third attempt through IVF. And then she had done, almost 18 attempts thereafter to have another baby, and there was no success. And what ended up happening with her was that she went, you know what, I've got to do something different because what my doctors are telling me to do is really not working anyway. Look at the number of failed cycles that we've had in all this time. So she came for the purpose of preparing for IVF. But I told her at the time, because I had those two successes that I was kind of thinking about, and I couldn't really find anything. When we did the proper diagnosis of her case and everything else, there wasn't anything that stood out that said, this is just never going to happen naturally. But in her mind, it was never going to happen naturally because that was her experience, right? And so I went, okay, look, let's prepare for IVF if that's what you really want. But I really think that you could try naturally a few times. And then if that doesn't work, then go to IVF. They kind of pretended to hear me, and humor me for a little bit. But we did the treatment. And then, as soon as I said to them, look, you can start trying. Let's start trying naturally and see what happens. They were kind of like, no, we've never conceived, before naturally. Let's just not waste our time. So they went straight to IVF, but they basically, and they did the cycle, and the lining, because of the drugs and everything else, the lining was too thick to transfer. So the doctor recommended, and we recommended, that they don't transfer in that cycle, that they wait a cycle and then do the transfer. So meanwhile, freeze the embryo and do the transfer once, that was how it needed to be. And in the cycle that they were waiting for the transfer, she ended up conceiving naturally.
Wow.
So again, yeah. So that was my third. You know how things happen in threes? So that was my third kind of experience that I went, okay, you know what? This is it. We're just going to focus solely on fertility. We're going to look for these really difficult and complex cases, people who have typically done everything and nothing has worked. I will not work with anybody at the time who has not been trying for at least 2 years, or who hasn't experienced miscarriage, or who doesn't really have a kind of diagnosed infertility problem. And that's how then, you know, we did what we did for many, many years. And then we ran the study and everything else. And now we know, you know, that this program and this treatment works when other treatments have failed, when miscarriages have occurred. You know, of our patients, 51.5% have miscarriages or have experienced miscarriages before coming to us. And that rate drops to 13.5% after treatment. So it gave me a lot of confidence to know, okay, well, you know what? This is the right path, and this is certainly the right path for an alternative for patients who are experiencing these difficulties. But that's how it all started. You know, it was like that desire to help people transition, you know, themselves through difficult experiences and those challenges of life that really got me passionate about what it is that we do today.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty unbelievable to hear the stories of like the 10 years or 19 years. And I looked on your website, and I saw some of those testimonials about that. It's very, obviously very encouraging to see that, because people going from like less and less hope after year of treatment, because it's impossible to have more hope when like that much time passes. It's very difficult.
Absolutely. And when that much has failed, you know, like those 3 cases, I actually have written about them in Fertility Breakthrough, my book, which is Fertility Breakthrough, Overcoming Infertility and Recurrent Miscarriage When Other Treatments Have Failed. People can listen to it on Spotify. It's available for free. But, you know, I wrote about those 3 cases that I've talked about. They're actually written up in the book, so people can really understand a whole lot more of the nuances that were going on for these people. But, you know, you're absolutely spot on. You know, think about it. We sometimes do things for 5 minutes and we go, I can't do this. Give up, right?
Right, exactly.
And so, you know, this idea that infertility is ongoing for such long periods, or people who have had multiple failed pregnancies. You know, it's a similar situation, but it's even more traumatizing, because you then have lost the hope of not only having your baby, but the fact that you're then grieving this loss of potential, you know, this loss of what could have been. And I think that in infertility, there's a lot of that. You know, there's a lot of that immense sadness and grief that when people haven't tried to get pregnant, they don't really understand, you know. And I think that a lot of times infertility is not given the platform that it deserves. Why? Because there's a whole other agenda that goes on. You know, one of the things that happens is that there's the overpopulation conversation. You know, most people will conceive without trying. And that's what happens in the general population. In the general population, 1 in 6 couples is infertile, which means that another 5, left, right, and center, are having babies without trying. And the majority of couples actually don't try to conceive. It kind of happens, right? And so we are conditioned to believe that, okay, well, this should be easy, you know, and when it's not, then we have to have this whole other mindset to be able to overcome those challenges. What's also really interesting, you know, if we look at population data and epidemiological data across populations, we know that at peak fertility, a couple has an average of 3 months time to pregnancy. So literally, it's have sex, get pregnant, have a baby, done. We're no longer having this conversation. When we're still having this conversation, then we need to start really asking questions, because a minor factor or a minor obstacle, for example, when I was 18, I was told that, you know, you have polycystic ovarian disease, you are likely never to have a baby. And I was like, okay. And I was told this over the phone by a doctor, and I was thinking, wow, that's not very good bedside manner, but that's a whole nother story. But, you know, I was thinking for so many years that, am I actually even ever going to be able to do this? Which for me, because I had this mindset of, you know what, I'll just do other things with my life. And I think that because I learned about it early on, I also had time to kind of go, well, what is my life going to be like if I can't have a baby? But for a lot of people who are in that situation, you know, it's more difficult. But going back to the stats, what happens is that if we have, just for example, polycystic ovarian syndrome, you know, one particular minor factor, all of a sudden we go from an average of 3 months time to pregnancy to an average of 2 years. So there's a quite exponential impact there, but it gets worse because if we have then, let's say, for example, lowered sperm count, and these days we've been seeing through the data, and, you know, in a 50-year period, men's sperm count has decreased by 50%. And we can talk more about why that is, and it's preventable. But the reality is that, you know, if we have low sperm count, for example, which is a common factor amongst males, in this day and age, then we have two minor factors. Two minor factors takes us from an average of 2 years time to pregnancy, excuse me, to an average of 7 years time to pregnancy. And a third minor factor, which is not very difficult to have. I mean, you can just have a bad diet and that could cause some minor factors as well, right? And all of a sudden we go from an average of 7 to 40 years. Nobody has 40 years to get pregnant, right?
Right, exactly.
And so those are really important things for people to consider when they're thinking that, well, you know, one thing that I always say to people is this: if you think that you might want to be pregnant in 10 years from now, start preparing now. It's really like that. And in fact, you know, I'm such an advocate for people to start preparing before they actually even, you know, they're in the nappies, to be honest. You see, fertility is transgenerational. What do I mean by that? What we know now from lots of research on fertility is that if a mother smokes and she has a baby boy, that boy is much more likely to have infertility. Right? We also know that if your grandmother's diet was poor, you are much more likely to have infertility. So imagine, with fertility being having a transgenerational impact, it's not enough for us to just think that we're going to do drugs, drink alcohol, have bad food, and be exposed to all sorts of things. I mean, think about it. Who doesn't carry their mobile phone in their pockets these days at some point? And we know specifically that that kind of radiation will negatively impact sex cells, right? Sperm health, egg health, and so on. So this is what I mean. If you're thinking that you might want to be pregnant in 10 years from now, you really want to start looking at your exposures. You really want to start looking at the things that you do and that you don't do. You know, there's a thing that I talk about, which is act pregnant now to get pregnant later. And what do I mean by that? It's like, and I say this to men and women. So, Milan, I'm going to ask you to indulge me here for a moment, right?
Sure.
And you're going to be my participant in this little quiz that I'm going to give you. But I want you to imagine for a moment that you could be pregnant. Okay? So can we play?
Sure.
You play with me? All right. So you're going to imagine that you could be pregnant. Okay? Now, I know that if men could be pregnant, the world population would immediately decline. Right? So that could be a good thing for future scientists to study, is ways to make men pregnant. But all jokes aside, if you could be pregnant right now, close your eyes for a minute and imagine this. What are the things that if you knew you were nurturing and nourishing a baby, that you would absolutely start doing or that you would absolutely stop doing right now? Just give me top 3. What are 3 things that you think that if you were nurturing a baby right now in your womb that you would start doing or you would stop doing?
So this is before... so I am pregnant at this point.
No, you're pregnant right now.
Right now.
You're pregnant, yes.
I think, in my opinion, like sugary drinks, like anything like that, I'd be much more aware of.
Great. So sugary drinks. What else?
Sweets. I don't know if that's a huge rule or not. It's just my opinion. I don't know. I have to look into that, but
yeah. But let's add that to sugary drinks. Let's make it a little bit more compelling for the audience. Let's add sugar and sugary drinks to the same category. Give me a second. What else would you start doing or stop doing immediately? Think about that beautiful baby. What would you feed a baby? What would you not feed a baby, for example?
Right. I would probably stop having like big technology devices around me, like with the radiation factor. If that still affects it, I don't know if that would at that point, but
you would reduce the exposure to electromagnetic radiation. Great. Yeah.
Right.
What else? So that's a second. Give me a third.
Third. I'm not sure. I don't know. Those are the top two I can think of.
What about smoking? Would you smoke if you were nursing?
Oh, definitely not.
Okay,
no, definitely not.
Or
drinking too, alcohol.
Drink
right.
copious amounts of alcohol, right? Okay, so just look, you're not trained in this, and you've given me some great answers. Right? Those are 3 perfect answers, actually. And they are not even the tip of the iceberg of all of the things that people would do. If you asked a woman this question, she would give you a list of 10 things, literally like this. She would know that she has to stop eating cheese, drinking, smoking. She would take her prenatals. She would eat well. She would exercise. She would be very careful about the types of places that she goes, the things that she does, whether she would even color her hair, whether she, all of these things would literally kind of like roll out, right? Because women are much more conditioned, by the way, much more educated when it comes to this. Most men don't understand that fertility is actually a team sport. You see, 50% of that little baby that you want to create, if you're pregnant right now, 50% of that little baby is already inside of you right now, in the form of sperm. Right? So that means all of the things that you would start doing or you would stop doing in order to nurture and nourish that little baby, when you are pregnant, you would start doing it beforehand. And typically much, much longer than just a month before. Right? And that's why I say, start thinking about it in transgenerational terms. Start thinking about it that you and what you do right now impacts what your grandchildren's health is going to be like. Not just your children's health. And whether you're actually going to be your grandchildren are actually going to be able to reproduce. Because, for example, when couples sometimes they can't conceive and they go down the IVF path, depending on the reason as to why they have IVF, for example, if a man has a Y chromosome deletion, which is a genetic factor that negatively impacts sperm quantity, typically count, right? And a couple goes and does IVF. If they end up with a baby boy, that baby boy will not be able to reproduce without IVF.
Wow, it's like 100%.
So you're breeding an infertile population from the outset.
Wow.
Right? So there's all of these factors that you then need to start thinking about. Hang on, how does this affect? And it's not to say, some men with a Y chromosome deletion will still be able to actually affect the pregnancy. In some cases, it's possible. So, and have naturally, healthy children and, all is well. But the truth is that all of these factors that we sometimes don't consider and we sometimes don't think about do play a role. Right? And it's not a woman's issue. Infertility, miscarriage, it's not a woman's issue. It's actually 40% to do with male factor, 40% to do with female factor, and 20% to do with embryonic factor or idiosyncratic factors, which sometimes are difficult to find or unknown. But the truth of the matter is that it's never just going to be one thing or one person that is going to result in an outcome. I often talk about the fact that, when couples are experiencing fertility problems or miscarriage issues, whatever it is that we're seeing is an end result whether it's infertility, whether it's miscarriage, those are end results of many biochemical chain reactions that start all the way over here. So if we don't address the issues and the factors that we see, we end up with more of the same result. Why is that? Well, it's simple. Every system is specifically designed to deliver the outcome that it delivers. So whatever it is that we're getting, whether it's infertility, miscarriage, other reproductive issues, that system of 40-40-20 is currently specifically designed to deliver the results that it's delivering. So if we want to have a different outcome, we need to start looking at things very, very differently.
Wow. Okay. That is a lot to unpack, but that's very valuable information. That's very interesting. I 100% agree with you, and it's not even really agreeing with you because it's a fact from what you said. So I'm agreeing with the fact that, like, with the sperm and the egg, or from the male and female perspective of like having a child together, that it's not just like the woman's on her completely, because it takes both to form a baby. It takes two people, and I do believe that that's definitely not. It's not really publicized too much, that kind of idea, because we always think about, woman X has had a miscarriage, and we're all like sad for her and everything, but it's never, not that you're looking for a solution immediately. Obviously, you need time to grieve, though. The solutions never involves the guy. I've kind of noticed that, at least from what I think about it, because it's always, even like someone close to my family went through something like this, and I didn't even think twice to think about her husband at all. But just because I think,
now you know.
right, exactly, and I think it's because there's not too much education around this, because it seems very black or white when it really isn't like that.
That's true. Right,
and I have one question for you about like your work, and that maybe this might be kind of too detailed or too specific for my audience to understand, but what separates your work, your organization that you started, and the successes that you see with that? And because I read from here, let me see if I can just find it real quick, where it's called like evidence-based, like holistic, supportive, and education-focused approach. Mm-hmm. What, with those like three terms in mind, could you unpack like what that means and how that's unique to what some of your patients have dealt with 10 years in the past and had like missed opportunities?
Yeah, no, look, that's such a great question, and I love the fact that you're asking me, because you see, what you're asking me is exactly what my doctorate is about. Right, I'm doing a doctorate at Harvard right now, and it's in public health. And in public health, really, the premise of public health is interesting. I don't like it, to be honest, because really the premise of public health is that you need to do the absolute least for the largest number of people, right? Because there's limited resources. There's limited funding, limited resources, lots and lots of people. So when it comes to public health and even education on the issue of infertility, really it's an underserved population. Because really, if we think about it, let's be conservative and let's say that there's 100 million people in the world that are infertile, right? If we're looking at that, or who are wanting to have a baby without success, if we look at it from that perspective, 100 million compared to 7 billion, where does the attention go?
Not to the 100 million.
Not to the 100 million. Not to the 100 million. Right. Any day of the week, right? And so what happens? Healthcare systems are overstretched. And we saw this during COVID more than at any other time in our lifetime. Right, we saw very clearly what an overburdened healthcare system across the globe looks like. Now, when we have the burden of disease that we have in every country around the world, do you really think that we are going to prioritize something that is not kind of the norm of the necessity of the population? Are we more likely to prioritize heart disease, diabetes, obesity than we are, which are massive killers, right? Other than infectious diseases, which are also massive killers, right? Are we more likely to prioritize those things and put all of the dollars that we can towards those things versus infertility, given that it's 100 million versus 7 billion? Of course, right? So what happens in healthcare systems around the world, depending on what kind of healthcare system we're talking about, if we're talking about a universal healthcare system, which, for example, in the UK and part of, Canada it can also be, described as a universal healthcare system, where basically the healthcare system provides for the entire population, no matter what. Okay. So what that basically means, and no matter what is in inverted commas there, because obviously it doesn't have all of the resources to provide for everybody in no matter what kind of situation. So in those healthcare systems, what they're looking at is how do we reduce costs? Okay. And on the other side of that, how do we make money for the healthcare system if we're providing a service, right, that is not essential? Infertility is a non-essential, considered, sadly, a non-essential service. So what happens in universal healthcare systems when the government provides IVF cycles, they're wanting to do it for the least amount of time, of money, for the least number of people in the population. And if there is a private arm to that, they want to charge and make money so that they can fund other areas of the healthcare system. Okay. In other markets, for example, the US, where it's not a universal healthcare system, there's a lot of competition and, there's basically just different ways in which it operates. There's a lot of private clinics that are then set up because there is the opportunity to make money. Now, make no mistake about this. IVF and fertility treatments is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Multi-billion. It's like 26 billion and it's growing, right? So what happens? Are we likely to be prioritizing patient outcomes and true essential health care in terms of those patients? Or are we likely to just go, hey, the more cycles we make, if we need 8 cycles to have a baby, why would we want to reduce it to 5 cycles or 3 cycles or no cycles? Makes no sense from a financial perspective, right?
Right.
And so that, and the healthcare system is organized in such a way that if a patient, like if you today went with your partner to see a doctor because you weren't able to conceive, the referral would be to an IVF doctor who can then do some testing. And at the end of that testing, typically in that testing, they're looking at, okay, are you eligible? Are you an eligible candidate for IVF? And let me screen all of your kind of major potential issues, which would be infectious diseases, liver function, kidney function, and just kind of like, seeing that we have sperm, that we have eggs, and, that things are kind of operating so that we can then make a referral to IVF, as opposed to looking at, okay, let's take a step back. We're not conceiving. What are the factors that are getting in the way? How are you eating? How are you sleeping? How are you exercising? Are you having enough sex? Are you having quality sex? Because that actually improves fertility, right? Are you actually doing things that are addressing your mental health? We know that in periods of stress, hypothalamus, pituitary, ovarian axes, and testicular axes are majorly affected by high levels of stress. Cortisol will increase inflammation, will imbalance reproductive hormones. It does all sorts of things. And imagine when you're infertile, how do you feel? Do you feel relaxed?
No.
Even if you think you feel relaxed, you don't feel relaxed. Your body is in that kind of fight or flight for long periods. And so it will impact physiology. But because of all of those factors, really, those are not looked at all in standard therapy, what we call standard therapy, which is, when you go to a GP or your general medical practitioner and they basically refer you to an IVF doctor. So what we do is very different to that. We still utilize and really heavily focus on proper diagnostics, right? So we will utilize the healthcare system in order to be able to really diagnose and understand what's happening. We'll work with other medical doctors and we'll make sure that all of that is how it needs to be for the purposes of understanding what are the biochemical pathways that are being affected and creating this result, so that we can then work holistically in every area of a person's situation, body, mind, and spirit, right? To look at, okay, how else can we optimize this person being at their very best? Because what we know, and, again, 2 decades of doing this work has made it very clear to me that when people are operating at their best, all of a sudden their body works in the way that it's meant to, or that it was always meant to. Right? So that's the difference. That's the major distinction. So we're looking at how do we optimize, those pathways? How do we optimize everything that we're doing for the easiest, best possible outcome with the lowest amount of intervention possible? In our study, what we saw was that almost 50% of patients who came to us actually experienced failed IVF attempts prior to coming to us. And in our overall live birth rate, which 78.8% took home babies, 47.7% conceived naturally. Only about 31% actually needed IVF, despite half of people coming to us actually having had previously failed IVF cycles.
And I feel like that's a tough thing because with a lot of, this is my perspective, when people like seek help or seek advice or seek treatments, in my opinion, it's like, or my perspective more so, seems to me that you're kind of entering a store, but it's kind of like this long 5 to 7 packet project to get to where you want, but it's not even guaranteed it's for you specifically. It's like a strategy in that way. Just kind of a hyperbole I thought of, but because I think that's what's really tough with the medical field in general, and why there's a lot of distrust sometimes with like doctors and all of that, because some people don't know, some people may have bad experiences in the past, and it's a tough thing to see. But I'm really glad that you're really highlighting this need for the 100 million conservative estimate you gave with this in particular, because it's definitely something that definitely occurs, but it's almost like you look at it, and because for me, at least when I think about it, it's almost like, when someone has a baby, like I haven't had any children yet, but it's almost like you're like, thank God I can have children. It's like, I'm not like her. When it sounds really negative, but to me it seems like that's kind of how people think about it, because it's almost like they're like these endangered people, and it's like, I don't want to be like that.
Yeah.
Because
I think that. Yeah, and what I will interject and just mention here, for a lot of people, you're absolutely right, but it comes from a place even deeper than that, which is, it's this feeling of being broken, it's being something so fundamentally wrong with you, which so many people endure. And that's one of the biggest stresses of infertility in its own right. It's not even whether you're going to be able to conceive or have a baby or not. It's this really kind of deep grief of missed potential, right? What would my legacy be, or would it have been if I was able to conceive if I can't, right? And this really deep aspect of shame and being broken. And this is one of the biggest things that I talk to my patients about all the time, because I say to them, and we go through lots of processes and work for them to understand that actually they are complete right now, as they are, with or without a baby. A baby does not complete a person, right? But there is a perception when you are, think about it, right? That is the thing that you want the most. For me, that was never my experience. Like, I never grew up, playing doll, thinking one day, oh my God, I'm going to have children. Like, that was not my dream. But for so many girls, it's their dream. It's their kind of, like, and even boys. I have one boy who, he just looks at the side of that baby, and he's 7 years of age. he looks at the son and he's like, oh, that baby's so cute. Oh, Mom, look. And literally, he's like gushing over, any baby he sees. I've got another child who couldn't care less. It's like, oh, yeah, baby.
Right.
But, some boys have that too. He will see anything cute and he's like, I can only imagine. I've never asked him, but now I'm probably going to. What do you think when you see those babies,
Mm-hmm.
But that's the thing. It's like, it's what somebody carries in their heart for such a long time. And then when it doesn't eventuate, there's a huge disappointment that comes with that, except that in this situation, this is meant to happen. This is fundamentally what we are born to do. We are born to reproduce. Whether you become a millionaire, whether you buy the beach house, whether you would do, those things might happen. They might not. Nobody's going to die because of it, right? But if we don't reproduce, there is major, consequences for the lineage of,
right.
of humans. And so we carry that within us in a big way. There was a study that was published, and I will never forget this result. I read in this paper, it was a study of infertile women, and 20% of the women studied were asked the question, what would you prefer? The women who were studied, they were asked the question, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to be paralyzed or infertile? 20% of the women responded that they would prefer to be paralyzed than infertile.
Wow.
So imagine. Yeah, it's big. It's big. It's bigger than we who don't have that dream or who have never thought about it or who for the first time are coming to, to terms with that conversation. Bigger than we would have realized, at the outset for many people. And look, doctors are doing their very best. The reality is that it's the structure of the healthcare system that perpetuates this inequity and inequality. It's not doctors. Doctors are not the enemy. If they had more time, if they had more space, if they had more holidays, if they made more money for the amount of effort that they put in, then things would be better around. If the healthcare system was structured in a different way, if instead of being paid per cycle, IVF doctors were paid per baby, it would immediately change things. But
Right.
where there is money to be made in an industry as big as this and as emotional as this, then patient care unfortunately suffer and patient outcomes and quality of patient outcomes sadly, go through the floor.
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, you mentioned that idea of earlier about treating this smaller population, which I don't. Of course, we both don't agree with that necessarily. It's a minimal population, but a lot of people dealing with this problem in their lives. It makes me think of all the doors that are open for other illnesses or diseases that could be treated or solved that aren't really. Don't have a spotlight right now.
And what's interesting, you've just reminded me of something that I've come across recently, which is a study that showed that if a woman is diagnosed with infertility, she has a 32% higher risk of dying from all-cause mortality. So what does that mean? Basically, if you have an infertility diagnosis, even if you have a baby through IVF, for example, and try to bypass those issues, the precursor issues or the coexisting health conditions that had led to infertility remain unaddressed for the most part. And because those things are unaddressed, whether they are irregular blood sugar dysregulation, or whether it's thyroid dysfunction, or antiphospholipid syndrome, for example. Antiphospholipid syndrome is something that happens, that causes DVT, that causes stroke, that causes heart attacks, and it also causes miscarriage and stillbirths, right? And for many couples who experience, and it's not the be-all and end-all of miscarriage and stillbirth, but certainly for many couples who experience, that's something that we check for, because what happens is that if you have that, you're much more likely to experience a miscarriage. But what is often unknown to those patients, because they're so focused on fertility, they're focused on having a baby and taking home a healthy baby, they're not actually told, hey, this is something that you actually need to address so that you don't have the higher risk of stroke and heart disease and DVT down the track. Right? So, and for men, it was even worse. The result was 67% of men who were diagnosed with infertility actually had a higher risk of all-cause mortality. So imagine, infertility in this situation is almost a wonderful opportunity. For our patients, certainly it's a wonderful opportunity to optimize their health and their quality of life for the long term that in the standard healthcare system gets completely missed.
Wow. Very well said. That's a very interesting point you make with that. And it's I have to say you do a great job with finding a way, like a positive outlook to shape that into. And I truly believe with the organization you started and you're the director of, you have to have that mindset with it, because I think you have to, whether your coworkers or whoever works with you, like build off that viewpoint, that perspective, that point of view, so that when there's great cases like this that people are able to conceive and there's like hope there, like it kind of bounces off each other. I'm trying to think of the right way to say that, but like kind of like the momentum is there in a way.
Yeah.
Or even if it's not there all the time, at least like it's a good opportunity to give people the chance for a successful birth or closure if that's needed as well. So I really love that the way you put that together.
A pleasure. No, it's so important. I think that one of the critical things when it comes to any challenge that we're facing in life, right? Whether it's infertility, miscarriage, whether your boyfriend has dumped you, or whatever it is, right? At the end of the day, you have to find a way to make meaning of that situation in a way that benefits you. Because otherwise, it's so easy to stay down in the dumps and despair about the things that we perceive we want and we don't have. And we forget that really it's in the enjoyment of the journey that is all of the juice. It's where we actually make meaning and have fun and enjoy ourselves and live our lives. Because, one of the things that I talk to my patients all the time, and I had a patient session before we started this conversation today. And I said to these patients, I said, listen, one thing I have learned and I know to be absolutely true, and I know for sure from personal experience as well as professional experience over 2 decades, if you are not happy now, you are not going to be happy no matter what you think you're going to tell me when you have a baby. Do you know why? Because you are going to be sleep deprived. You're going to have a child who I had a child my first child, oh, God bless that child. He did not sleep for more than an hour, literally 20 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes all the way through the day and night for the first 9 months of his life.
Wow.
Whereas normal children, right? Literally, my second child, he came home from hospital and was sleeping 5.5 hours from the first night, right? This other child of mine, bless him, it took me 5 years to get that child to actually be able to sleep through the night. So imagine, in the first 9 months, I was running a practice. I had this new baby, which I had no idea what to do with. Like, your first child, you know nothing. Like, honestly, you're just like praying that, they come out okay. And you know nothing. Right. And so I thought, okay, well, this is normal. But at 4 months into it, I was like getting 30 minutes of sleep in a night, literally. That's no exaggeration. I was up for breastfeeding. By the time he finished breastfeeding, you've got to put him down. He would get up every moment. I'd have to hold him the entire time. Then it would be time to start breastfeeding again. And so, literally for the first 4 months, I didn't know what to do. Then I started to get some help from, my husband and, all of that to be able to actually go, okay, how do we actually make this happen? And it was at 9 months that I was like, okay, I cannot do this anymore. I'm going to have to do something different. And so we ended up hiring this sleep consultant and, finally we were able to make him sleep for a little bit longer. You know, like I think the first night he slept for 5 hours and 5.5 hours. The second night, 7. And I thought, oh my God, my life for sure is better. Like, I never valued sleep as much as, you know, at that time. But what it also showed me is that the reason that I could cope and the reason that I didn't go completely crazy, because honestly, it tipped me almost over the edge. But the reason that, that it didn't completely finish me was because I had built resilience prior to, and I was an optimistic person prior to going into that situation. You know, sometimes when you've been experiencing challenge after challenge after challenge for a long time, your resistance drops, right? Your ability to cope with things is not the same. And that's why I say, if you're not happy now, if you're not working on building that resilience, that ability to cope, that ability to see things from a positive light, now, trust me, when you have a baby, it is going to be a disaster.
Wow, and I fully agree with that. And not that this relates completely to what you're saying with regarding like fertility, but just in general, I've always thought that anytime you're thinking of I'll be happy when X or when Y happens, I think that kind of ties along what you were saying. Right.
Such a flaw, isn't it? It's like it's the most flawed premise of humanity is I'll be happy when. You know, no, you're not. If you're not happy now, you're never going to be happy when, because there's always going to be more. There's always going to be the next mountain. There's always going to be the next thing. And honestly, you're just going to, instead of enjoying the moments, you know, and savoring the path, you're literally just going to be running from one thing to the next, because the dopamine hit that you get from that short little split second that you get the thing that you want is going to wear off, and all of a sudden you're just going to be chasing your tail once more, and you're going to drive yourself to a place of exhaustion and questioning your whole life. And why am I doing this? Right? Mm-hmm. And so it's so important to really take the time to understand that it is about the moment. It is about the now. It is about the enjoyment along the path as opposed to a particular outcome, because there's never going to be an end to the things that we need to do in this human life, you know?
Yeah, I like how we tied in philosophy into this, from medicine to philosophy. That's a great thing. I love that.
All-rounders.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, Gabriela, thank you for discussing this with me. Like, this complexity of all this. It's very fascinating to listen to this and learn more about fertility and the treatments about it, and all of that. And for those listening, where would you like them to see you, like see your information on your book or information about your practice, anything like that? Where would you like to guide them to?
They will find everything they need at fertilitybreakthrough.com. So that's just fertilitybreakthrough.com. And if they Google me, Gabriela Rosa, they will find me. Great.
I'll include that link below as well, so that way it'll be easier for listeners to find you. And great. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming on. It was a blast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. If you enjoyed that segment of the Nolan Sharma Show, consider subscribing and clicking the link in the description section to follow the show on all of your favorite audio platforms. Also consider supporting the show if you really enjoy my mission of having powerful conversations through civil discourse. Cheers.